One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. So if you can picture what happens, they're just walking along, and they pluck off some heads of grain in order to eat them, presumably. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" So apparently, the way they see it, that was work. And Jesus has a couple of different responses, but I'll point you to verse 27. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And just to kind of get some insight into what's going on here, if you study that commandment, the fourth commandment in the Old Testament, one of the reasons that it was given was that God's people used to be slaves. There were masters who told them to work every day, 7 days a week. As long as they were awake, they were supposed to work. And God set them free from that situation and said, okay, your life isn't defined by your work anymore. You're set free from that. And Jesus' response shows that there's some insight here when he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, that their interpretation of not working had become so rigorous that they were just enslaving people to commandments now. He says that's not how it's supposed to be. But just for the purpose of bringing this discussion forward some more, verse 24, they're not just thinking to themselves, they're not just asking his disciples, they're not simply asking Jesus a question. Now the way I would put it is this, they're actually confronting Jesus. They walk up to him and they say, "Look," I sort of picture them grabbing him by the collar, "Look, Jesus, why are they doing what's unlawful on the Sabbath?" So if we're making this list out, now they're openly confronting Jesus. See how as the controversy is building, there's something dangerous about Jesus, and now it's just getting right out in the open. "Look, Jesus, who do you think you are?" And then we get to the story that we read at the beginning here in chapter 3. Jesus is in the synagogue, he's teaching, and there's a man with a shriveled hand there, and these teachers of the law who have been getting into it with Jesus are saying, you know what, let's watch to see what he does with that guy in order that we might accuse and condemn him. And Jesus, knowing what's going on, it's like he doesn't avoid these controversies. He actually has the man stand up in front of everyone, and he turns to them, and it's so insightful. I mean, the irony that drips off this. He asks them this question, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill? And here's the irony. I mean, here are these people who have built up all these laws about all the things you cannot do on that day and have even enslaved people to those laws. And on the Sabbath day, while Jesus is teaching, they're actually working at putting Jesus to death. And there's this man who needs healing. And they're wondering whether he is going to work at bringing healing and life to this man. And he stands up, he says, "Listen, you who are experts on what the Sabbath day is all about, is it lawful to do evil or lawful to do good?" And it's very interesting how the Bible puts their response. It says, they remained silent. Ever give someone the silent treatment before? What are you thinking about that person when you give them the silent treatment? Is it like warm fuzzies, you're feeling good about them? No, I mean, there is an open hostility that they have toward Jesus. And verse 5 says that he looked around at them in anger and was deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. And he turns to the man, he says, "Stretch out your hand," and the man does, and his hand's completely restored. And then verse 6 says, "Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." And so for the purpose of filling this out, you can see the progression, right? First, they're just thinking things in their head. Then they're going to his disciples. Now they're becoming more bold. They go and ask Jesus himself. Then they become even more bold. "Look, Jesus, who do you think you are?" And finally, as these controversy stories go forward, it ends with them ready to put Jesus to death. And this is right at the beginning of his ministry. I mean, there are a lot more stories and chapters to be told here, and they are all ready to put Jesus to the death. There's something that's dangerous about him. And I want to spend some time talking about a particular phrase in here in verse 5. And I think there's something that, hopefully this just pushes your image and picture of who Jesus is a little forward here. Verse 5 says, as they remained silent to his question, that he looked around at them in anger. He looked around at them in anger. They were sitting there silent, and you know what it's like to give someone the silent treatment, what's going through their hearts. And Jesus sees the condition of their hearts. He's deeply frustrated by how stubborn they are. And the Bible says he looked around at them in anger. Now, if this is to inform our picture of Jesus, you probably have to put out of mind the flannel graph picture of Jesus holding a sheep, smiling nicely. We like to think of Jesus as this nice man, this kind person who we could always turn to, and he is loving. But I would suggest to you that there's something important here, and we ought to pay attention to the anger of Jesus. And I would even put it this way, that we all profess together that we have a loving God. And I would say that if you don't at times find an angry God, then you don't really have a loving God. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that by actually turning to the Old Testament, Amos chapter 5. You can find that on page 650 if you're using one of our church Bibles. If you don't have an angry God, I would say you don't really have a God who's loving. And there are times where it's appropriate to be angry. And all throughout the Bible, if you read the Old Testament, you'll find that there are times where God gets angry. And I want to just take note of what those times are and what it is that just makes God mad, angry. Chapter 5, verse 21 is where I want to pick it up. God's speaking here. He's speaking to people who are his people, who are worshiping him. And God says, and I want you to just catch the words here, I despise your religious feasts. This is the God who at the center of the universe is love, who exists in this Trinitarian relationship of love, who says, I despise your religious feasts. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. And this is a picture of God who's just ticked. He's mad. He's angry. I hate it when you come in here and worship me like that. Get out of here. You're bringing in your God songs. You're singing these praises. You're bringing your offering. Get them out of here. I don't want anything to do with them. And what's the reason? Look with me in chapter 8. Just kind of page forward. Begin reading in verse 4 of chapter 8, the book of Amos. God says this, hear this, you who trample the needy, and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended that we may market wheat, skimping the measure, boosting the price, and cheating with dishonest scales, buying the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, selling even the sweepings with wheat. Apparently there